catch me, they're gonna throw me back in the hospital, and they're gonna ask me 1,000 questions, and I'm not gonna be able to answer because I'm gonna sound crazy. Okay, they're gonna stand there with their notepads, and they're gonna make me take all these pills, and when I refuse, that'll make me seem even crazier. Meanwhile, Molly is gonna be dead, buried at the bottom of some hole in Forest Park.
The 2012 film Gone. It follows the story of a young woman, played by Amanda Seyfried, who survived an abduction and fears her sister has been taken by the same perpetrator. His place to deposit his victims? Forest Park. The film correlates well historically, as in 1999, Todd Allen Reed abducted 3 prostitutes from the Portland area, whom he raped, strangled to death, and then deposited their bodies in Forest Park. Even as recently as November 2017, a 15-year-old girl's body was found shot to death, alongside a 23-year-old man, also shot, whom authorities believe abducted the girl and then killed her in a murder-suicide. Forest Park stands in the hills to the west-northwest of downtown Portland. If you've ever seen the city from the east and seen the hills in the background, you've seen Forest Park. The park was established in 1948 and covers over 5,000 acres of land. Despite being on the edge of this bustling city, locals love the park for its unending trails and the calm quiet that comes with a place that makes you feel like you're out in the middle of nowhere. It's a perfect place for a hike or a bike ride. Families and outdoor enthusiasts are out here daily, taking in all the massive outdoor oasis has to offer. But as with anything in this life, there's 2 sides to every coin. And for all the beauty and grandeur contained within Forest Park, there's a potential darkness as well. The sad truth is, rustic, secluded places such as this are convenient body dumping grounds, or, sometimes, convenient places to commit a crime itself. This occurred in one of its most gruesome forms in Forest Park on the night of November 26th, 1960. It was Thanksgiving weekend, and 19-year-old Beverly Allen, a student at Washington State University, was in town to visit her boyfriend, 19-year-old Portland State student Larry Peyton. They had dinner at Peyton's home before making a trip to the recently opened Lloyd Center shopping mall. They were reportedly last seen in the downtown area by a Mike Adler who knew Larry personally. He saw the young couple near Broadway between 10:30 and 11:30 at night, the last time they were officially seen alive. It is also known, however, that the couple ultimately found their way to a dead-end gravel road, at the time known as Mountain View Park Road, that traveled into the heart of Forest Park. The following evening, November 27th, officers searching the area of the park for stolen and abandoned cars stumbled onto Peyton's 1949 Ford Coupe, still parked along Mountain View Park Road. Peyton was inside, slumped in the driver's seat. He had been stabbed 23 times, and a part of his skull had been caved in. His blood was everywhere. His blood-stained dress shirt had been removed, and his car door was wide open. He had mud splattered on his face, as well as the side of his door, suggesting a fight had occurred just outside his car. His wallet, as well as Allen's purse, were still in the vehicle, showing that this was not a robbery gone wrong. A small penknife was found on the hood of the vehicle. It's still unknown how the knife got there, but it is known the county sheriff had rummaged through the vehicle before the real investigation began, meaning the crime scene had been corrupted from the very beginning. A black wool men's sock was also found at the scene, 8 feet from the driver's side of the vehicle. A 1.5 feet of green nylon cord was found in the street behind the vehicle. And finally, there was a bullet hole in the front windshield of the car, towards the passenger side and a few inches above its base. But there was no bullets or shell casings to be found at that time. That wasn't all that was missing, however. Beverly Allen was also nowhere to be found. This brutal assault was destined to go down as one of Portland's greatest unsolved murders. The murder was clearly the act of a crazed individual who, with the disappearance of Allen, likely had a sexual motive of some kind. The crime scene had already been compromised, and there was little to go on the outset. The sock and the cord were a total mystery, and the knife that was found there was found to belong to a John Town, one of the crime's early suspects, but it was not involved in the stabbing. Town had known Peyton for years and could not explain how his knife ended up at the crime scene. Town represented very much the focus of the police's early investigation. Larry Peyton was small and bespectacled, but had an aggressive streak in him. He'd had many altercations with young toughs and frequented parties with these same types of people. And there just happened to be a big party going on at a little house on Thompson Road, less than 4 miles away, the night he was killed. But before stretching out to places down the road, the police had to focus on those closest to the murder scene. After all, there had been at least one gunshot and presumably a scuffle with yells and screams from Peyton dying and Allen being taken away, presumably against her will, from the scene. Arthur Binford was in the same area when the murder happened, also entertaining a young woman. He said they were roughly 50 yards away from the murder site. They had been on the site before Peyton and Allen's arrival and were there till at least 2 a.m. The time of the attack is approximated to have occurred between 12:30 and 1 a.m. Binford only recalled seeing 2 vehicles pass by during all that time. One passed before 12:30, and the other passed around 1:30, reportedly carrying 2 men and 1 woman. But Binford didn't hear any sounds from the attack. The Voss household, nearby, was approached by authorities, and the children of the home had been watching TV until approximately 1:30 a.m. They didn't hear anything but their dogs barking, which was a common occurrence. Then there was the Crawl residence at 1300 Northwest 53rd Drive. This was the closest home to the murder scene. Irving Crawl, 59, was determined to not be home when the murders took place, and his wife reportedly only heard their dogs barking as well, but no sounds of the attack. With little help from locals, the rest of the populace wasn't much more helpful. Multiple unfounded tips came in, lots from those already serving time and looking to cut a deal. John Town was dismissed as a suspect when his parents said he had been in Seattle visiting them during Thanksgiving weekend. An alibi, only supported by his parents, kept some suspicion on Town, who reportedly had a violent streak in him and was reported as being a sexual deviant, and the police believed there may have been a sexual motive, again, to these killings, with the male Peyton being killed and Allen being taken away, presumably alive. Town had earlier in his life been charged with exposing himself to his neighbor, and he'd been arrested for making lewd calls to women as well. A former friend of his, Omar Knowles, called him a sexual psycho, and even believed Town had been having sexual relations with his own mother. Even by 1964, Town was still considered a primary suspect. In December 1961, Athelma Richardson reported to the police that her sister-in-law, living in Northwest Portland, had found a switchblade on top of a cupboard with dried blood on it. The sister-in-law also felt the knife could only have belonged to one of 3 people who had roomed there, but likely had been involved in this murder. These three that had roomed there left Portland shortly after the murders occurred. They were ultimately traced to Los Angeles, and when detectives found them, one of them, a Billy Mock, admitted to owning the knife, but not knowing how blood got on it. It was later found that these three had fled Portland not to escape a crime, but to evade bill collectors. They were determined to not be connected to the murder whatsoever. Much later, in the spring of 1962, a woman, Barbara Blackwell, would be pulled over by police in southeast Portland. On the side of the road, Barbara would tell the officer that she believed her husband, Arnold Blackwell, was Peyton and Allen's killer. When the couple had lived in Great Falls, Montana in 1956, while Arnold was stationed there at an Air Force base, a young couple was found dead there. The woman had even been removed from the car and left down a hill, seemingly similar to Beverly Allen. The Blackwells had only lived 5 blocks from the murder site, and Arnold would later be discharged from the Air Force, diagnosed as a paranoid schizophrenic. Barbara also stated that her husband was a rapist who happened to be out the night that Peyton and Allen were killed. Arnold would later be checked out and found to be innocent of both murders, despite the wild fact that he'd lived in both these towns where similar murders had occurred less than 5 years apart. With tips like this coming in, the trail began running cold, but that was when a major shift happened in the case. On January 9th, 1961, 6 weeks after Larry Peyton was found dead, highway maintenance employees found the body of a dead woman in a ravine, dressed only in pants and wearing one shoe. Oddly, she had 15 feet of green nylon cord shoved down her pants, similar to the cord found next to Peyton's car at the crime scene. Her other clothes were scattered close by. This woman was later identified as Beverly Allen. She was found 40 miles west of Portland, near the small town of Timber. She had been raped and then strangled to death. Pubic hair, not belonging to her or Peyton, had been found on her person. At her autopsy, Dr. William Lehman felt she had likely died only hours after Peyton, and her body had been abandoned along the highway for a very long time. At the same time, however, authorities on site said her body would have been extremely easy to see from the highway, and yet she was left there for weeks before anyone found her. The amount of time Allen survived after this attack would remain a place of contention for years to come, and will be discussed more later. Allen's discovery, and more where she was discovered, brought on some new potential suspects. First, a young naval man named Wayne Buddy came into question. He went AWOL from his Astoria naval base on November 26th, the day of the murders. Had Buddy been traveling to Portland from the coast, he may have gone down Highway 26, passing in close proximity of the murder site and right past where Allen's body was found. However, Buddy wouldn't be found for a long time. He would ultimately be discovered in the woods, blown to pieces by explosives in an apparent suicide over losing his fiancée. He was crossed off the list. More suspicious, a resident of Buxton, 7 miles from the Allen discovery site, Lewis Forrest was seen stopped along the highway right at that location. When police questioned him, Forrest said he'd been out there cougar hunting with his dogs. Intriguing enough, Forrest's brothers-in-law, Dave and Darrell Gamrath, had extensive criminal records and had been partying at the Skyview Barn Dance, not far from the Peyton murder site. Some theorized the brothers may have committed the murder, while Forrest assisted in getting rid of Allen's body. Alas, there was nothing else beyond speculation and Forrest's convenient placement along Highway 26 to show that these men were involved. By the summer of 1961, the now double murder was still unsolved, the public still unsatisfied. Then, in June, the dismembered remains of a young woman, Joan Caudle, were found in 2 locations of southeast Portland. Some felt the Peyton Allen murderer had struck again, and would continue to do so until captured. Caudle was ultimately found to be the first murder victim of serial killer Richard Marquette. In what may have been a break in the Peyton Allen case, it was quickly established that Marquette was not their killer. More wild tips, more dead ends. But that was seemingly about to change. In a mix of tips from those in the pen, the next one to have a story to tell was Louis Calcagno, serving time in the Rocky Butte jail on rape charges. A week before the murders, Calcagno said that he had been working with a man he could only remember as being named George, in ripping off a drug dealer. They met on November 27th, the day after the murders. George showed up with blood on him, claiming he had a fight in the Skyline area and killed a guy. Calcagno later passed a polygraph test. In addition to the name George, Calcagno felt his last name started with the letter C. During a major manhunt, the police discovered a George Claflin working in the crab trade on the Oregon coast, who somewhat matched the description given by Calcagno. However, Claflin's boss said that he had been at work at the time of the murders. But this was not the end of the Louis Calcagno story. Like him, William Holloway, another with a criminal record, reported to the authorities that he knew someone who admitted involvement in these killings. This man was named Lee Roberts, and when Holloway was released from jail 2 days after the Peyton murder, he met up with Roberts and felt he bore some responsibility. Move ahead to December 1964. A Clackamas County inmate named Eugene Simmons turned the tables, telling authorities that Holloway was directly involved in the killing and that he did it with a man named Ted Clark. Simmons had another major revelation to reveal. Ted Clark was driving a car with a boat tied to it, and the top of the boat had been tied off with green nylon cord, just like what was found at the murder scene and on Allen. When confronted with the Simmons story, Holloway changed his own story, saying when he got out of jail, he went to Lee Roberts' sister's house and saw a nude girl on a bed, her face all bloody, presumably Beverly Allen. He put the murder on Clark and Roberts, saying they were driving around looking for a score and happened upon Peyton's '49 Ford. And finally, 4 to 5 days after Peyton's murder, they took Allen into the basement of the house and strangled her to death. They then threw her body in Clark's car and ditched it along the highway. Next, authorities turned their attention to Clark, who denied knowing anything. But what's interesting is the letter that his last name started with, a C. Clark was taken to a lineup for Louis Calcagno to see, and he immediately ID'd him as the George he had known. Clark's pubic hair was compared to the hair found on Beverly Allen and found to be microscopically the same. With Multnomah County District Attorney Des Connell needing to solve a double murder case over 4 years old, detectives began pressuring him to pursue indictments against Roberts and Clark. But Connell was not convinced. It was still just circumstantial. The ride got even wilder in May 1965 when William Holloway contacted detectives again to say he was having a meltdown and needed to tell the real truth. He then told authorities that after getting out of jail, he went to Lee Roberts' house where he saw Beverly Allen. He then admitted, in graphic, gruesome detail, his direct involvement in the brutal raping and strangulation of her. He also said that Ted Clark had not been involved at all. Holloway's sudden admission of guilt was hard to take. On one hand, why would he lie about such a thing? But at the same time, this was at least the third time he had changed his account of events. But instead of pursuing indictments, at least against Holloway and Roberts, D.A. Connell began shifting gears. It was revealed that one of Allen's fingernails had broken off at the murder scene. To verify Allen's time of death, they had her casket unearthed to test that broken nail and used it as further evidence that she died only hours after Peyton did. This, officially, blew the Holloway-Roberts story out of the water, since Holloway's story suggested that Allen lived for days after the attack on Peyton's car. This, in effect, put the case back at square one, almost 5 years after the killings, and no fresh leads. By the beginning of the fall, 1966, the trail had run cold and was remaining that way. The lead detective on the case, Earl Sun, did an interview for the Oregon Journal regarding the case, asking to speak to anyone who might know what happened and to speak to them in confidence. The ploy seemed to work, as only weeks later, authorities received an anonymous letter from a woman later identified as Lorraine Jorgensen, who said she knew a man named Eddie Jorgensen, no relation, who admitted to being involved in a killing where a guy got murdered and that he went back later to wipe prints from the scene. It was theorized the wool sock found at the crime scene may have been used like gloves to wipe prints from the crime scene. This was not Lorraine Jorgensen's first time getting involved in the case. She had reported that she felt a next-door neighbor may have been the killer way back in 1961. She was found to be lying about this. But with Eddie Jorgensen, she was unrelenting, and, interestingly enough, these two met when Lorraine put her home up for rent so she could move. Eddie and his brother Carl convinced her to lower her monthly rate and, perhaps by coincidence, Eddie began sleeping with her. She would later say Eddie told her to stop wearing a certain perfume because it reminded him of another woman from Washington, like Beverly Allen, who he said he had sex with for a few days. When checking with Allen's college roommate, she said Allen mostly wore the perfumes Taboo and White Shoulders. Lorraine Jorgensen just happened to also wear these two types of perfume. While Lorraine Jorgensen, bit by bit, was painting Eddie Jorgensen as a new potential suspect, another inmate named Craig Cameron wrote a letter to authorities conveying a story about a young woman who admitted to his mother that she was there when Larry Peyton was killed and Beverly Allen was taken. She said she had been with 3 guys and they chased Peyton and Allen. She also claimed to be Peyton's ex-girlfriend, whom he had pushed aside for Beverly, and thus she expressed that Peyton, quote, got what he deserved, unquote. Cameron couldn't remember her name, but remembered her friend as being named Linda Carlisle. Checking in on Carlisle, the authorities found another troubled youth who had been mixed up in a botched golf course robbery with 3 others. It was found that the drunken youth behind the wheel of this botched robbery was a woman named Nikki Salick. Authorities went to visit this one-time troublemaker, who by then was married and went by the name Nikki Essex. She had no memory of being at the murder site or telling anyone that she had been. But she immediately became fearful that she had been there and had perhaps blocked out her memory. What would follow from this would be one of the most ethically questionable efforts to find the truth of an unsolved crime in the history of Portland law enforcement. Essex would be put under hypnosis repeatedly, sometimes after taking a dose of sodium pentothal, to try and recover her, quote, memory. Still, she struggled to recall anything, but gradually, so it seems, she began to recover bits and pieces. She eventually recalled being with Eddie and Carl Jorgensen, as well as another local tough from the area named Robert Braum. Then, she eventually gathered bits and pieces in regards to seeing Peyton and Allen. But even as she was under hypnotism, she would question if she was just imagining these memories, or perhaps even creating them because they didn't actually happen. Essex's eyeglasses had also been found near the crime scene, and up until hypnotism, she'd said that she had lost them weeks before the murders. But now, through hypnotism, she admitted she had lost them while at the crime scene. Finally, Essex ultimately recovered, presumably enough of her memory, to put the experience back together. But just as in the Holloway Roberts case, there was still no solid evidence. When D.A. Connell said he needed more before pursuing charges against Braum and the Jorgensen brothers, he conveniently got what he wanted: some physical evidence. The night of the murder, Linda Carlisle said she had stayed the night at a friend's house. Later, the sister of that friend, a Jackie Zimmer, would state that when her sister returned from a Christmas trip later on, she found her place had been broken into and trashed as though a party had been thrown in her absence. It was established a big party had in fact been thrown there around Christmas time, with lots of the usual party characters, like Robert Braum, being there. After this party, a handgun was ultimately found left in a pail in the home. The gun was turned over to authorities, but they still didn't have any proof that it was involved in the murders. Then, seemingly out of nowhere, a .32 caliber shell was found stashed in evidence that, according to records, had been found some 20 feet behind Larry Peyton's car. The shell was checked against the gun, and it was reportedly a match. Physical evidence. D.A. Connell finally had what he had been waiting for years to obtain. On August 19th, 1968, Robert Braum and Eddie and Carl Jorgensen were arrested, all on 2 counts of first-degree murder. While it seemed like the prosecution finally had a solid case, the 3 trials for each individual were in fact a farce. The prosecution relied almost exclusively on the testimony of Nikki Essex and Lorraine Jorgensen. Essex's whole memory seemed to be more an implant than an actual honest-to-goodness recollection, and Lorraine Jorgensen was known to be emotionally unstable. In fact, when this aspect of her persona came into question while on the stand, Lorraine Jorgensen suddenly and conveniently fainted and was dismissed from the stand. Taken to the hospital, she was found to be just fine. Eddie Jorgensen's trial came first. With an inexperienced defense attorney, he never had a chance and was found guilty of the 2 counts. His sentence, life plus 25 years. But over the course of Eddie's trial, we got the first full story from Nikki Essex, the story that established the whole official case. The story she would tell at all 3 trials. She went to the party on Thompson Road that night. She then left with Braum and Eddie to go on a beer run. On the road they encountered Peyton and Allen and asked them to come to the party with them. When the 2 young lovers agreed, the 2 cars proceeded to street race back towards the house, at which time Peyton ran the car Braum was driving off the road. This was used as the motive for what would happen next. Braum, Eddie, and Essex went and picked up another car, picking up Carl Jorgensen along the way. As they drove back towards the party, they happened to stumble onto Peyton's car again. They chased the vehicle, and Peyton turned into that dead-end road, forced ultimately to stop. The other car stopped as well, and Brome and the Jorgensens approached Peyton. A fight broke out, and Essex claims she began running away at this point. Thus, she saw little of the actual fight. As she fled, she jumped in front of a car, hoping to get a ride. But it was just the same car she'd been in before, with Brome and the Jorgensens inside. Only now they had a fourth passenger, Beverly Allen. While Essex would ultimately eliminate this from her story while she was under oath, when she first discussed seeing Allen in the car, she expressed that Allen appeared to be enjoying herself. Enjoying herself? After her fiancé had just been brutally murdered? It's no wonder the prosecution didn't want this aspect of her story to come to light. But it was this account that got Eddie and Robert Brome life plus 25 sentences. In the case of Carl Jorgensen, he had a solid attorney named Chuck Paulson and multiple witnesses who said he didn't leave the party until after the murder had occurred. He was acquitted of all charges. Even decades after these trials, Nikki Essex is unsure of what really happened. She would be quoted as saying, "You don't know what it's like, spending your life wondering if you're crazy or not, wondering if you couldn't remember something that really happened, or if you remembered something that didn't." Chuck Paulson would later describe her, quote, memory recovery as a raping of her brain. It's readily accepted that the trials of Robert Brome and Eddie and Carl Jorgensen were a farce, an effort to save face with a murder case that had loomed unsolved for nearly a decade. District Attorney Connell used and manipulated the system the best he could to get convictions so iron tight that Eddie's life sentence plus 25 years only lasted 3 years before he was willingly paroled in 1973. Robert Brome would then be paroled in 1977. Even the prison system clearly didn't believe that they were ever guilty in the first place. Officially, it seems the matter has been closed. These men are still regarded legally as the guilty parties. But as far as the rest of the world should be concerned, this is still an unsolved murder case. As far as the other possible suspects, it's intriguing to go back to the story of Arnold Blackman, whose wife Felt killed a young couple in Montana, as well as Peyton and Allen. It was later learned that a serial killer named Edward Wayne Edwards not only also lived in Montana at the time of that murder, but lived less than 2 blocks from where the young couple had been slain. And who would have guessed? He also just happened to live in Portland when Larry Peyton and Beverly Allen were murdered. Not only that, investigators saw Edwards on the scene of the crime while they were examining the murder scene. Edwards even discusses this in his 1972 book, Metamorphosis of a Criminal, in which he deceptively presents himself as a reformed criminal. After being paroled from a Montana prison, he was sent to Portland to stand trial on another charge that he was also paroled for. In regards to the Peyton and Allen murders, Edwards states the following. One evening, in November 1960, in a lover's lane on the west side of town, a boy was shot to death, and his girl companion was abducted. The crime was given extensive publicity. Many sightseers visited the scene of the crime. Since I had an appointment for a demonstration the following day in that part of town, I asked Johnny if he wanted to check out the area with me. Like everyone else, I too was curious. We were standing around, watching the policemen clean up the area, when one of the detectives began taking down the names and addresses of all the spectators and the types of cars they owned. Then the detectives advised us to go home. I decided I'd better call my probation officer and tell him of the incident, knowing that the police would be sure to check out all the names and addresses they'd collected. Edwards also had a bullet wound in his arm, and since at least one bullet was fired at the crime scene, Many have theorized if his wound resulted from that shooting. Edwards claimed that his wife had done it long before. He was reportedly never seriously considered as the killer at the time, even though in his book he tells of a jail meeting after he was arrested for pulling fire alarms around town, wherein multiple detectives and his own probation officer grilled him, accusing him of having some connection to the murder. After this, Edwards had his friend call the jail, posing as his probation officer, telling them his bail had been posted and, believe it or not, Edwards was released. He and his wife immediately fled Portland and days later were in Kentucky. To this day, Edwards is the prime suspect, at least in the eyes of the public. But in all fairness, aside from his presence at the crime scene later, which is suspicious, potentially his arm wound, his criminal reputation, and the fact that he fled town, which in all fairness could have also been just to escape a lengthier jail sentence in Portland, there was little else to say that Edwards was one of, if not the killer, of Larry Peyton and Beverly Allen. History has also given Edwards credit for some of the most notorious murders ever committed. He's been theorized to be the lipstick killer of 1946, the Black Dahlia killer, the Zodiac killer, the killer of Martha Moxley in 1975, and John Benet Ramsey in 1996, and has even been called the real murderer in the Steven Avery case, the case discussed in the Netflix series Making a Murderer. Officially, he was proven to have murdered at least 5 people before his death in 2011 at the age of 77. So this man was a serial killer, and it is worthy to note that in 2 of his known killings, in 1977 and 1980, he had murdered couples parked in their cars, much like in the case of Larry Peyton and Beverly Allen. Edwards is definitely a possibility, along with the fact that he was definitely in Portland at the time of the killings. However, it's not a certainty, and practically everyone today believes the trials of Robert Braum and Eddie and Carl Jorgensen were a farce to say the least, just to try and solve the case and get convictions out of it. This means that, to this day, the murders of Larry Peyton and Beverly Allen are technically unsolved. Now, since the murder happened, the prevailing perception by law enforcement has always been one of 2 things. One, that Larry and Beverly were either chased or at least followed to the site where the attack occurred. And the other perception is that there were at least 2 people involved. One to murder Larry and the other to subdue Beverly while that was going on. Now, while that perspective has prevailed through the decades and is still believed by law enforcement, it was even believed by the detective who was in control of the case for years, I personally believe, after lots of reflection on the case and looking at whatever evidence is available and trying to make sense of it, I believe the murder actually went down a very different way. To me, the Rosetta Stone of this case is the placement of Larry Peyton's car. Now, if you look at crime pictures, you'll see that his car is parked up against a landmass, almost a natural abutment. This means that after pulling in to Mountain View Park Road, he had actually turned a 180 and was parked facing back the way they came, because if you're going that direction, the abutment is on this side. This tells me that Larry and Beverly had no reason to believe that they were being pursued and that they were simply trying to find a private place to have a romantic time together. And it's very common for car people, and by all accounts, Larry was very into his car and working onto it. It's a very car person thing to do, to, instead of just pulling in and parking, you pull around to make it easier to leave when you're all done. It's essentially the same concept as backing into a parking space when you arrive somewhere instead of just pulling forward into it. Then when you have to leave later, it's an easier exit. There's nothing about that suggests that they were chased down the road. If he's being, chased down this dirt road,
for what reason would he be turned and facing the other way if he's trying to get away? The only logistic thing that you can come up with is that most of the way down the road, he wanted to pull a sharp turn and possibly go back and sneak past the car that was chasing them before they could be stopped. The key question then is, why would he have just stopped on the side of the road there? The only reason he would is if the pursuing vehicle had maybe skid to a stop and cut him off. However, if you look at images of the scene immediately after the crime and you look at the dirt on the road, there's no signs of severe skid marks, a car coming in sideways, you know, to block off the road, anything like that. So there's no evidence that anything like that happened. It seems beyond any other, you know, wild theories one may come up with, that Larry and Beverly went to that spot. They saw that it was a gravel road, likely a dead-end road going into Forest Park. They knew it would be secluded. They knew they would have privacy, and that's why they went that way. It had nothing to do with them being chased. And logistically, if they were being chased and they end up on 53rd Drive, which is a main paved road, why in the world would Larry Peyton turn off onto a side road that dead ends if his whole entire purpose in going that direction is to get away from someone? Either Larry Peyton knew this route, which means he would know that it was a dead end back in 1960, which means he wouldn't go that way. Or he didn't know the route, which means he didn't know where it would lead to, which means he wouldn't go that way. And while I don't believe they were actually physically chased to that scene, which is the theory put forward in the trials against Robert Braum and the Jorgensen brothers, I also don't believe that they were being followed in general by someone who was just kind of tracking with them. And the reason for this is, how would the person following them know that this couple, these two people specifically, are going to go down a dead-end road to achieve a lover's lane type scenario? The only way they would know is if they got that information directly from Larry and Beverly, which means they would have had to encounter this person at some point and apparently do something to piss this person off to the point that they would track with them to where they were going and then kill them. And the problem with that is, if Larry and Beverly are planning on going to a secluded spot to have a romantic time alone, why would they give someone such specific details as to where they're going if the whole objective of them going to that spot is they want to be alone with nobody there to bother them? It seems incredibly unlikely that they would have given details that specific to some random person that they encountered. However, that would really be necessary if someone was just going to track with them where they were going, because why would you just follow a young couple in a vehicle if you have no idea where they're going? Killers like that, you know, track the people they want to kill. They murder victims of opportunity, and sure, once they were in that secluded spot, Larry Peyton and Beverly Allen were victims of opportunity, but while they're out on the road, they're just a couple driving around. How would somebody following them not know that maybe they're just going to a restaurant, or maybe he's taking Beverly home? How would they know exactly what was going to happen? So it seems incredibly unlikely that someone would even be tracking with them. This leads to my theory as to what happened, which is, I personally believe whoever killed Larry and abducted and later killed Beverly Allen was someone who either lived in the vicinity of Mountain View Park Road back then, or it was at least somebody very familiar to the area who knew those back roads and knew what went on in that area. It's important to remember that this specific area was a haven for all these young people, including the types of people that ultimately got in trouble and went on trial for this case. They would go into Forest Park and they'd have wild parties, they'd get drunk together, Lover's Lane type stuff like that was happening all the time. These young couples going up into the hills of the park and on these side streets to go, you know, do what they wanted to do. And I honestly think somebody in that vicinity was I'm sure people all over that area were super fed up of these young people going out there and doing this. And someone saw Larry and Beverly, two young people in a car going down a dead-end dirt road into a secluded park. What would you think they were going to do? And this individual, whoever the person was, decided to follow them up that road. If anything, to tell them, hey, I'm sick of you kids coming out here and doing this crap. Turn your car on, get out of here. And when they arrived on the scene, you know, interrupting this romantic time between Larry and Beverly, Larry, who again was kind of a hothead, it would not surprise me if he would have opened his door and stepped out and gotten confrontational with this guy. He's telling them to take off. Larry says, hey buddy, why don't you mind your own business and get out of here? This escalation goes from, you know, merely a verbal exchange, maybe there's some pushing happening, it gets a little bit more physical, and this guy who goes up to confront them has a knife on him, you know, a protective type weapon. He pulls it out, you know, threatens Larry with it. Larry goes to his car, perhaps to get a firearm. Now, multiple people who knew Larry said that he owned a handgun, and one of his close friends said that Larry told him personally that he kept a gun under the driver's seat of his car. So Larry goes to his car to pull his gun out, not necessarily to shoot the guy, but if this guy's going to threaten him with a knife, Larry's going to get a better thing, pull a gun out and threaten him with the gun. So the killer sees Larry going down to grab a weapon, probably presumes it's a gun, and both out of a mix of rage and potentially the desire to, you know, fight for survival if this guy's going to pull a gun and shoot him, and he immediately attacks Larry, and Larry's crouched down like this trying to grab his gun, so he's coming in from above and stabbing him however he can. And I theorize that Larry gets a hand on his gun, and while he's getting stabbed and attacked, you know, he's going to suddenly be in a, you know, fight for his life situation. So he fires the gun, you know, in this kind of a direction while he's being attacked. That makes for the bullet hole that occurred in the passenger side window of his car. And, you know, once a shot goes off, this guy's still stabbing him, and that's how you can kind of get an explanation for why there were so many stabs on Larry's body without it necessarily being a wild serial killer that just went out there, walked up to the car, and just started stabbing him. We also have to keep in consideration the fact that Larry had a massive fracture in his skull. Now, if he's down here, you know, struggling, and the killer's coming in from above, he could have taken the base of that knife, whatever kind of a knife it was, and, you know, while he's stabbing, he could have struck him very firmly in the head, hard enough to crack his bone. And Larry, you know, as he's bleeding out, he drops the gun. The killer quickly grabs the gun and pulls it away because Larry can maybe get his hands back on it. And what if Beverly Allen gets a hold of the gun? So he quickly grabs the gun and gets it away. That can explain why there was no gun found at the crime scene. At least in all the information I've looked at, there was no mention of a gun found at the crime scene. But we have a bullet hole in the windshield, we have a bullet that's never found, and a shell casing that's found behind the vehicle, which that was one of my biggest contentions. Even for a while, it made me think that maybe the murder happened elsewhere and then the bodies were transplanted here, because how do you have a bullet going out the front windshield with a shell casing found in the back? Well, I personally believe, you know, if Larry is shooting upward and out the window, it's likely that bullet just vanished in the deep recesses of this massive forest park. It could have landed anywhere in a portion of the park that's untraveled. It would have taken probably months to even find this bullet. And, you know, the biggest deal for me for a while was that shell. How does a shell from a gun that once you fire it, it immediately ejects the shell, how does it end up 20 feet behind the car? Well, after thinking about it and the fact that this shell went rather unmentioned, it apparently wasn't found in the immediate aftermath of the crime scene, which you'd think it would be, it wasn't really brought into prominence until this gun was found in a pail at some woman's apartment that apparently the likes of Robert Brome and the Jorgensen brothers had been to. They find the gun, they want to connect it to it, and then suddenly they find this shell in evidence that apparently was found a few days after the killing, which is really strange. And suddenly they pull the shell out and they connect it with the gun, and it's a match. And that was what they used to finally arrest and arraign these three guys that I, and practically everybody else, think and pretty much know are innocent of the crime. So that makes me very suspicious that this shell was even remotely involved in the case. So that's how you explain that evidence. And as far as the other things of interest, the nylon cord, the sock that was found, it's really hard to say. You know, considering the fact that it's probable that lots of other people went up into this area and, you know, partied up there, did whatever. These things that were found, it's hard to say. Now, it is important to note that there was a bunch of cord found with Beverly Allen's body when she was discovered that matched very closely a little piece of cord that was found at the crime scene. It's hard to say that there's not a connection there. So did the killer have this cord? It seems very likely, but overall it's hard to say exactly what that means to the case. It's something you can just theorize about like anything else. And furthermore, I dismiss the necessity of having more than 2 killers there, because obviously, as my theory has shown so far, this was likely just one person who went up there and told him, hey, get the hell out, and it's something that escalated very quickly. I personally don't believe that this killer needed an extra person there to subdue Beverly Allen, because as I was looking at the crime scene pictures, Larry Peyton's car is parked right up against that kind of landmass, that abutment, again, if you will. And it's so close that literally his front passenger side fender is almost digging into it. Because of that, there was likely only, you know, maybe this much space between the passenger side door and that abutment coming up, which leads me to believe that if Beverly Allen wanted to escape out the passenger side door, which she would have had to because the murder's happening right here to her left, she could have tried to get that door open. I don't think she would have gotten it. I think she could have maybe gotten the door open like that far, and she would not have been able to escape that way. She would have literally had to sit there screaming and struggling like insane as she's watching the love of her life getting murdered, and there's no way for her to get away. And at that point, once the killer has finished stabbing Larry Peyton, he can either just reach in and grab her and drag her over his body, or he's got the knife, he's got the gun, he can point her and say, hey, you, get out of the car now, and what's she gonna do? And that could have easily been how one guy was able to kill Larry Peyton and then abduct Beverly Allen. He could have taken her at gunpoint and said, you know, don't scream, don't run, don't do anything, or I'll kill you too. You know, because she's a witness at this point. He may have even knocked her unconscious so she'd be quiet. And this brings us back to the story of Irving Krall, who I discussed earlier, who was dismissed as a possible suspect because, as he claimed, he was in Eastern Oregon when the murders happened. Krall's house along 53rd Drive was the closest residence to the murder scene. And essentially what Krall used to justify his alibi was he apparently presented receipts that showed that he was out Eastern Oregon way. Now, if you look at receipts from back in the 1960s, it's not like it is today where it's, you know, a computer printing it out and it has, you know, the exact time and date and all that stuff on it. That stuff was all done by hand. It would have been incredibly easy to forge or, you know, misrepresent receipts to show that you were somewhere that you weren't. He also claimed that he had a woman traveling with him who justified his story. He was like, oh yeah, I was out traveling with him. However, this Krall guy, and again, I'm not saying he's the murderer. I'm just theorizing that he could possibly be the guy because I don't feel like his alibi is that airtight. He could have easily threatened this woman. Now, why do I say that? I say that because Irving Krall had a history, literally a criminal record. He was a sex offender. There were multiple women that he literally threatened with violence if they did not have sex with them. He also had a record of illegally carrying a concealed weapon. So of course you can logistically think if he's going to go up to confront some people up in the dark, he might have a weapon like a knife on him. He was also a repo man. And any repo man will tell you they carry weapons for protection. I mean, when you're working a job where the main thing you do is take something away that is critical to people's lives, like their vehicle, they're going to have a weapon on them in case that person gets confrontational. So it's logistic if Irving Krall is a guy, he's going to have a weapon on him as he goes to confront Larry and Beverly up the road. So with Irving Krall, we have a guy that not only has a penchant for violence, but would anybody be shocked if a guy like that, after killing Larry Peyton and kidnapping Beverly Allen, would not sexually assault her? And again, Beverly Allen is found raped and then strangled to death. And logistically, whether it's Irving Krall, who again is a local, who probably saw all this obnoxious stuff happening, he had dogs out in his front yard. And when his wife was interviewed on the case, she specifically said the reason they got those dogs was so they would have them there to protect their home, because there was always kids coming out creating problems and going out and drinking and raising a ruckus. So it's obvious that Kroll had an issue with these people coming up and doing that stuff around his property, and he lived right there. And again, whether it's him or anybody else in the world, logistically, if they get a hold of Beverly Allen and remove her from the scene, they would have had to hide her, you know, and then likely once she was murdered, she maybe was stored somewhere secret, maybe stored in a fridge or a freezer or something like that. People who have murdered, whether they're serial killers or someone who just committed one murder, they will put bodies in, you know, a large freezer or something like that, and you keep her hidden away until the heat dies down, and then after a few weeks, you take her out and get rid of her. You take her out 40 miles west of Portland and deposit her elsewhere, so maybe people think somebody from somewhere else did it instead of you, someone who lives right in that area. And it almost worked, because the moment her body was found, there's this guy, forest guy, who claims he's out cougar hunting, and he got a lot of attention focused on him just because he happened to be in that area. And it's also important to remember that when Beverly Allen was found, you know, the presumption was she was killed very shortly after the murder of Larry Peyton, and that she'd been deposited out there along the roadside for a long time. Now, I referenced that she was in a place that was very easy to see by anybody passing by, so it's very unlikely that she'd been there for a long time. On top of that, when she was discovered, authorities were shocked to notice that she was not in anywhere near as an advanced stage of decomposition as she should have been had she been left out there in the elements for several weeks. Aside from some kind of facial deconstruction, her body was still almost intact, which suggests she was put somewhere like a freezer and kept cold and almost in a makeshift mummified state. So that's kind of what I theorize happened with Beverly Allen. It would not surprise me at all wherever she was kept after the murders happened. It was probably somewhere pretty close to where the attack happened and Larry Peyton was murdered. It's also worthy to note, because the authorities and the people that, you know, the DA that tried to convict Brahm and the Jorgensens for this crime, they tried placing the murder before 1 a.m., and they actually dismissed a very significant eyewitness account. And all things considered, I believe the murder happened closer to 2 a.m., which is more deeper into the night. More people are asleep. Less people are going to notice. Less people are going to see the perpetrator when they go out there and commit this deed and then sneak Beverly Allen away. There was, and again, this was completely dismissed, not even brought up by the prosecution in those trials, who wanted the murders to happen earlier. There was a gas service attendant named Raymond Ward who claims to have seen Larry Peyton's car come in and get some gas. And he said there was a young guy and a young woman in the car. And again, this is somewhere around 1:30 a.m. And he sees our car pull up. And his detailed account was so much that he even said that he noticed the name Gabriel etched onto the side of the car, which, as you've probably seen in pictures I've shown of the crime scene already, the word, or the name, Gabriel, is etched on Larry Peyton's car right next to the driver's side door. Ward also said that the car had a loose-fitting gas cap. And when authorities looked over the car right after the murder, they also mentioned that the car happened to have a loose-fitting gas cap. Of course, when these trials came along years later, authorities shifted and reversed that, and then suddenly when asked about it, they said, oh no, it was a tight-fitting gas cap. Yeah, it fit just fine. So I think that's a bunch of nonsense that was put forward to create the notion that this crime happened earlier instead of later. There was a guy named Arthur Binford who said that he was also up there using the place as a lover's lane. And he said that he was parked only some 50 yards from where Larry Peyton and Beverly Allen were attacked. So probably right along the same stretch of road, just either further down or a little bit further back from where Larry's car was found. This guy only saw 2 cars pass through, neither of which was Larry's '49 Ford. And so it seems like, you know, one of the last cars they saw passed through around 1:30, 1:45, and then they left shortly after that. So it's likely they left, you know, again, pushing 2 o'clock before Larry and Beverly even showed up. And if they were still there that late, why weren't they approached? You know, if there was just some killer out there looking to, you know, take out some Lover's Lane victims, why wasn't this guy attacked either? If he's right in the, probably almost within, literally within viewing distance of Larry's car, why did that guy go unnoticed? And why did he and his female companion never see Larry's car, never saw the murder take place, never heard the sounds of the gunshot going off and the screams of Larry as he's dying and the screams of Beverly watching it happen and being taken away? Odds are they left long before, or not long before, but before Larry and Beverly showed up, and thus there was essentially nobody really around, except for a few people that lived in houses, you know, a couple hundred yards away, many of whom were probably fast asleep by that point, besides, of course, the one person who was kind of fed up and decided to go up the road and confront Larry and Beverly. A decision that ultimately led to one of the most heinous unsolved murders in the history of Portland. I'm now on the fringes of Forest Park with downtown kind of back behind me. And then here's the edges. I'm already at a fairly high elevation, but I need to cross over essentially the whole entire West Hill to get to the site where Larry Peyton and Beverly Allen were murdered. This here is the beginning of what is known as Holman Lane. It's actually technically I guess it's a fire trail, but it's also here for people to use to walk up and down. From what I've gathered from hiking park websites, this officially became a fire trail walking path during the early 90s, is what I've gathered. And it's, I think, a little less than a mile up the trail to 53rd Avenue in the vicinity of where Larry Peyton and Beverly Allen were murdered. Actually, the opposite, the other half, the half of this trail on the other end was known as Mountain View Park Road back in 1960. And if you look at any old
documentation, newspaper articles regarding the Peyton Allen murders, they refer to their vehicle as being turned off down a dirt road called Mountain View Park Road. And even on my little iPhone, the little map app you get with it, it still regards this stretch, even though it comes all the way from 53rd through Forest Park and comes out here in the Pearl District. It still shows that there's only like half the route there, like it's a dead-end road, because back in 1960, that's what it was. So I'm going to venture up this route now to the site where Larry Peyton was found stabbed and beaten to death, and where presumably his fiancée Beverly Allen was abducted from. This is a very rough route. It is just straight uphill right from the get-go. But it's a very well-defined route. I'm wondering what this may have been back in 1960 if it didn't go all the way through from Mountain View Road. Based on where the little blue dot is and where they say the crime happened, theoretically, it was literally like right over this ridge. And I am completely out here alone. I haven't seen a single person since I started coming up this way. But as I'm getting much closer to where the official crime scene happened, the diagrams of the crime show that there was kind of an open area around where Peyton's car was parked. So maybe a turnaround, a good spot to pull off, I'm not sure, but I mean, here we are almost 60 years later, and I'm hoping there's going to be a big opening up here, but a lot can change in almost 60 years. And according to where my blue dots got me, I'm like right next to the site. So I am curious about this big open space behind me. My plan is I'm going to go up to 53rd Drive, which shouldn't be that far away. Officially, literally according to information posted right after the killings, they said that Peyton's car was found roughly 500 yards down Mountain View Park Road from its intersection with 53rd. So that's a little over a quarter of a mile. I'm gonna go to 53rd and then backtrack this way and use my mile distance counter on my iPhone, and I'm gonna get as close as I possibly can to the exact spot where these murders were committed. I didn't climb up all this hill for nothing. I think I'm finally approaching the end. Everything's beginning to open up out here. At the same time, it's kind of creepy. And as I'm filming along this route, and yeah, I can actually see there's Cornell. So 53rd is right over there. And then there's this random trail. Like, where does this go? Oh. Does it say you're something to hell, your mother? I'm getting like really fucking weird vibes up in here. I haven't seen this trail marked at all. What's this? Here's some kind of something. And it's just like a little man-made pond thing. Like, what was this? There's a tree growing out of it. I doubt that's what it was made for. It's banging up against this tree. Homestead of some kind. Oh, there's a bench. So, I mean, if this was just some weird, random, creepy trail, I'd hardly think This is interesting. What the fuck is happening? Sorry, my phone wigged out. I don't know. I'm still wigged out by this trail. What the hell is this? I saw this. This, like, distracted me. What's this? We've got, like, a square, triangle, circle. It's actually, like, padlock there. And we've got bells here and bells here. That's at these, like, crossing, these, like, archway crossing, rounding, branches coming together, and there's that there. That makes me feel even more weird. Like, it's cool looking, but I'm like, is there some kind of, like, weird-ass ritual shit going on out here? I mean, it'd be a perfect spot to do it. I don't know about that. That makes me more uneasy. I'm like, is somebody watching me in the bushes right now? If you are, I'm not here to mess with you. I'm just kind of walking through Forest Park trying to have a good time and psyching myself out in the process. We are now coming to the head of this route, so we're getting very close to what would be Northwest 53rd Drive. Here's the entryway to the route line, just like the other side when I first entered. So I can only hope or presume the entryway is right over this little ridge here. That's interesting. And it's very odd that, you know, in the discussion of this crime scene, that there's kind of sketchy outbuildings like that in this area. It's weird. This here is 53rd Drive. It passes through going downhill, wraps around that direction, and comes down to Cornell Road. Presumably, if they were coming from the downtown area, Larry Peyton and Beverly Allen would have come up 53rd this way, saw this route, which again was called Mountain View Park Road. It was, you know, it's not paved today, so it obviously wasn't paved then, and they would have gone down this route, presumably to find a spot to be alone together. Now initially I thought, because I saw a photograph of a vehicle right at the start of the road, so I presumed they just pulled off to the side of the road and were visible from 53rd Drive. I later looked at the picture again and thought that looked more like the police car that was captured in another crime scene photo parked next to Peyton's car. And when I looked at the diagram and news articles, it implied that it was further up, and news reports said that it was 500 yards up the road from 53rd. So I'm gonna backtrack that way. I did the math, and 500 yards equals approximately 1,500 feet, which is the equivalency of 28 hundredths of a mile. So we're here on the fringe of 53rd Avenue, literally right on the white line. So from here, I'm gonna count 28 hundredths of a mile, and that, you know, give or take 5, 10, 15, 20 feet will be the site where the murder occurred. Man, if only this sign was here back in 1960, maybe Larry and Beverly would have found another place to park. For all we know, might still be alive. I am now standing almost to the footstep 500 yards down road from where this route meets up with 53rd Drive. This is presumably where the murders happened, and obviously somebody had to have been off by a little bit, I would assume, because it's literally this downhill incline. There's a tree here. There's nothing really open. It's a little open right up here, so I'm wondering if maybe that's where it happened. Granted, it's, you know, I understand many years later, the terrain changes. You could barely get certain cars down this route now, but there would still be some semblances of what was once here in this area. That was interesting. That's a little bone chilling, considering the fact that I'm out here filming with the purpose that I am. This guy passed me up earlier going up the hill on his bicycle. He just came back, stopped, and was like, "Oh, doing some videoing?" I'm like, "Yeah." I didn't want to tell him what I was doing. I was like, "Oh, just filming around Forest Park." And he's like, "Yeah, I just got to the top and I'm with someone, and she didn't follow me up, so I hope she's okay." And he just went back down that way. So I'm thinking, like, in the context of thinking about Larry Peyton and Beverly Allen, that's, of course, the first thought that goes into my head is, I hope she's okay too. And I'm at the spot where the murder perceivably happened. That literally feeling chills on my shoulders. That was impeccable timing. Here's an image of the aftermath. You can see the police vehicle facing the opposite direction of Larry Peyton's car, so thus presumably Larry pulled in, turned, and was facing the exit, so that when they leave, they'd be able to go straight forward. Another reason I don't think he was chased here is, why would you turn? Now, maybe he would have turned to try to, you know, turn around and escape and get around whoever was chasing him, but why would he stop then? And if you look at this area, you can see there's kind of an abutment that his car's pulling up close to, and there's some darkness, some trees behind him, and it almost looks like there's kind of a downhill incline with just a lot of trees in the background behind him. So if I lower that away, and you see this ahead, like maybe this was really the spot. Now, if you look up this way, walking back towards 53rd Drive, you'll notice that there's a fairly consistent downhill incline that goes all the way up there, and it's all downhill until you get to this spot up here where it momentarily levels off before, as you can see in the distance, begins dropping down again. And it just convinces me more and more that whoever killed them, if they killed them on this stretch of road, Peyton and Allen had no idea that this person was following them. And it opens up to all sorts of possible theories. Did the person they encounter, were they further down the road and they saw them and Peyton got a little nervous and turned around? You know, it's... So since it seemed like Larry Peyton's car was kind of firmly up against some rough edges, I would guess it would be very close to this spot where, like, the front fender of his car would have been, like, literally, I'm using my coat, like, almost right in here, like, right up against that spot. So his car in general would have just been, like, right in this kind of area. And then the officer's car was here. And then, you know, you look at some of these trees, they don't look that old, so it's understandable to believe that this road may be stretched off a little further this way. You know, since the route starts going downhill, this is actually a perfect spot. You know, if you're kind of coming down this route and looking for a private lover's lane spot, you've got this one spot here where the ground levels out. You go too much further down there, you may, you know, get stuck in the mud. There may not be any better spots than this. You're already over a quarter of a mile down the road there. This would be a smart spot to park and have a quiet romantic time together. Yeah, and I almost want to say I can make it out, but if you look through these trees, you can see, you can't really see it with the camera, but the home that was along this route, that again I believe was probably the Kroll home, you know, just a little ways through these trees and on the side of the hill there from here. And then there was another house not too far beyond here, and none of them heard the gunshot, the fighting, the scuffling, Larry Peyton probably screaming in agony for his life as he was being stabbed, Beverly Allen screaming watching her fiance die, Beverly Allen screaming as she's being grabbed and pulled forcibly from the scene. People that were in fairly close proximity to this area, and none of them heard a single element of the crime. And aside from the birds chirping right now, if you're out here with me, even now, 58 years later, a lot more people around here, a lot more traffic. It is dead quiet here. You could hear a freaking pin drop in this area. Well, as the younger generation likes to say, I am shook.